talks resume again at 1 o'clock. If you're doing any of the contests, they all end at 4 and or 4:30, depending on the contest. So if you're doing that, check it out. Later today at 5 p.m., closing remarks are in this room. And after that, we're all going to the after party at the local hackerspace, Nullspace Labs. I hope you come. I will be overcooking burgers for you all night, probably. And you can play with my dog. So 2 for 2, right? You ready, Todd? Okay. Alex, you ready? All right. Coming up next is Alyx Lynd with DNS DriveBy, stealthy GPS tracking using open Wi-Fi. Give him a big round of applause.
Oh, I didn't know that was a thing. Thanks. All right, everyone. Thank you guys for coming. I'm really excited to be presenting this research. So this is a technique and a project and proof of concept that I've been working on developing on and off over the past couple of months called DNS DriveBy. Today I'm going to be showing a particular implementation and hardware demo that I built around this technique, which is a $10 stealthy GPS tracker that's built around a Wi-Fi microcontroller. So to start off with, I'm going to get the boring definition out of the way. So DNS DriveBy is a name that I coined for a WarDriving technique that uses open, unauthenticated Wi-Fi networks, basically as a way to exfiltrate Wi-Fi reconnaissance, GPS data, or any other sorts of telemetry over the internet as a low-cost alternative to like needing a cellular provider or a SIM card in low-cost projects. So before I dive directly into the presentation, I want to give some credit where it's due and also not take complete responsibility for something that I didn't come up with completely by myself. So I want to note that this isn't completely original or new research. It's built on the foundation of a lot of existing techniques and research that other people have done, like most good work is. So with this presentation, what I hope to do is a couple of things. For one, I want to obviously introduce what this technique is, what it's useful for, and also the implications as far as Wi-Fi and personal security goes. So what exactly is DNS DriveBy and how can you use it? As well as a short sort of like storyline for how I developed this project. But really the two main things that I hope to do with this presentation as far as some wider implications go, and bear with me, I'll get to this and I'll unpack this over the course of this presentation. But for one, I hope to demonstrate how I use microcontrollers in my projects as a way to lower the barrier to entry to security research, because personally I believe microcontrollers can be a very great low-cost alternative for building reconnaissance payloads and can also be more accessible for beginners that might not have access to more expensive tools and hardware like Raspberry Pis or things like that. And the second thing that I hope to do with this presentation is also showcase how I use microcontrollers for building pretty resilient reconnaissance payloads, and also how you might be able to use them for your security applications or engagements or things like that, as really cheap tools basically. So for a little bit of a background on myself, my name's Alyx Lynd. It's always a bit hard explaining what it is I do. There's a couple components to my work. I guess one part of what I do, I'm a cybersecurity instructor. A big passion of mine is teaching cybersecurity to beginners, and I guess as I sort of mentioned in the previous slide, lowering the barrier to entry for other beginners who want to get into this field. So one way that I fulfill that is through teaching. I host workshops at conferences and makerspaces with hardware that I create. And another thing I do is I create educational hacking tutorials for a variety of brand channels. One of them is Hack5. You guys might be familiar with them through like the Rubber Ducky or the Wi-Fi Pineapple or some of the other hardware that they build. And another component to my work, I'm also I consider myself a hardware hacker and a hardware developer. So I mostly concern myself with wireless security. That really intrigues me. So everything in the wireless domain like signals intelligence, Wi-Fi hacking, Bluetooth, IoT, and things like that. So I do contract work where I develop IoT products. I also do some IoT pen testing. And I try to fuse my interests together, as you will hopefully see in this presentation, by using microcontrollers, particularly low-cost Wi-Fi microcontrollers, as a way to showcase my interest in this domain and present this through content to other people who might find this interesting. If you want to learn more about my work, you can check that out over at the links below. So this is where we'll start with WarDriving. I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with this. It's a hardware conference. How many of you guys have used WarDriving in a project before? Raise your hands. Okay, cool. How many of you might have used WarDriving for a security engagement or a pen test or something similar, reconnaissance? Nice. And how many of you guys are just like hobbyists? You've used like maybe Wiggle on your phone or something? Okay, cool. That's great. So I don't need to dumb it down too much, but WarDriving is basically the heart of a lot of the projects that I work on, and also this one in particular, for a couple of reasons. When it comes to the beginner-friendly aspect, this is really great. It's a fun technique to perform. I like the mobility aspect. I like the visualization aspect, being able to like go around, drive around, gather reconnaissance, and then also be able to create like really visual demonstrations and renders like this. But in short, for those of you that might not know what WarDriving is, it's a wireless reconnaissance technique that basically takes like GPS tracking as a base layer, so you can walk around, drive around, for me preferably skating, and then just adds wireless reconnaissance as another dimension on top of this. So most phones are capable of this nowadays. You can use an app like Wiggle where you can drive around, scan for Wi-Fi client devices like phones or laptops or things like that, or even networks, and also plot this on a map. So what this lets you do is pinpoint like the precise location of maybe certain devices in your neighborhoods, and allows you to do retroactive reconnaissance, where you can do things like maybe query how many iPhones are in your vicinity, or how many vulnerable routers are nearby, or something like that. As it pertains to this presentation, in the top right corner, this is actually a map from a study that I did a couple weeks ago. So I found some online research, I think from Kaspersky, saying like 1 in 4 networks is an open, unauthenticated Wi-Fi network, and I was like, that's interesting, and also seems like a pretty big percentage. So I personally wanted to validate this, and also like every time I step foot outside my house, I pretty much fire up Wiggle on my phone, and I'm always WarDriving. So I literally just downloaded a data set that I already had on my phone, plopped this over into Python, and was able to create this visualization that showed me a heat map, or gave me a heat map showing me the density of open Wi-Fi networks in my city. And I was also able to basically confirm that statistic. Turns out 21% of the networks that I had discovered across various different plots that I got were open Wi-Fi networks, which is pretty cool. And we'll talk about the implications of that as far as it relates to today's project. But in short, I think WarDriving is really cool. I use it in a lot of my projects, and it's really great for visualization, and also it's just a great way to communicate topics, which is why I love covering it in my video content. So in the bottom right corner, I also mentioned that I like war skating. So these are some pretty embarrassing videos that I created like early on, like a couple years ago, where I kind of made it my brand to like war drive while I was skateboarding, and I thought that was really cool. So you guys can check that out if you're interested. Okay, but anyways, to prepare you guys for this next slide here, it's not really related to my presentation, but it is a pretty interesting piece of research. So this is a technique that's been cleverly coined screw driving. So a security researcher determined that certain IoT sex toys are vulnerable, or I guess you could call it a hidden feature, depends how you want to look at it, where basically these things blast out and announce their presence over an unencrypted Bluetooth frame. So not only is it trivial to discover like if your neighbors own one of these things, but you can also see like the level of intensity or like pleasure they're receiving with one of these things. But since the communication is happening over an unencrypted Bluetooth frame, it's also pretty easy for an attacker with a relatively cheap Bluetooth dongle to spoof one of these frames, arbitrarily like ramp up the vibrations, and like be a pain in someone's ass that day if they so please. So this is definitely one of the more stimulating applications that I've seen for WarDriving. Sadly, my project isn't nearly as cool as this, but I thought this was pretty funny. So for a brief background on WarDriving as far as it pertains to my presentation, and also how I've used this to build rigs over the years. A lot of my early research and introduction to hacking, I guess you could say, kind of came out of like a place of necessity, I guess I would put it. Growing up, we didn't have internet, so one of the first things that I taught myself how to do was how to hack into Wi-Fi networks. The first computer that I bought myself, I think like in 8th grade or my freshman year of high school, was a Raspberry Pi for this exact reason. They were low cost at the time. Now they're pretty damn expensive and hard to get a hold of. But yeah, I went down this whole rabbit hole of learning about like Kali Linux and the full suite of wireless pen testing tools that it offered, like AirCrack and B-Side-NG and like Metasploit and all these other fun things. And one of the first tools that I learned about was Kismet, which you can see in the bottom right corner running on the terminal on my Raspberry Pi. Are any of you guys familiar with Kismet or have used this before? Okay, cool. So this is a really interesting tool, and one of the first things that I did when I learned about this, I WarDrove my entire neighborhood, determined all of the Wi-Fi networks that were vulnerable, either using like default passwords from like my Spectrum setups, or if they had like pixie dust attack vulnerabilities. And I also kind of lived in, it wasn't like an old folks like neighborhood, but there were like basically a lot of people that were like ready to kick the bucket, but they had routers that had been around for quite a while, so there were like quite a few web encryption routers and things like that. Basically, like over the course of a couple months, I ended up cracking, I think, somewhere close to 20 or 30 networks. So that was really cool, and I was really stoked. WarDriving was really cool to me. Another thing that I would also do to entertain myself, this is kind of random, but right behind my house, there's also this Boeing, like right outside my neighborhood, so I thought it was like really freaking cool to just skate around the perimeter and gather intel on like their wireless assets and stuff. Never found anything useful. There were like a couple HP printers, I think like 1 or 2 ICS systems or stuff like that. But you can actually see that in one of the aforementioned videos I had on a previous slide, if you're interested. But anyways, I was using a lot of Raspberry Pis at the time. I built a couple of rigs. You can see a very early one that I built in the bottom right corner. It's basically a Raspberry Pi, a small 3.5-inch TFT screen, an external battery, keyboard, Wi-Fi dongle, GPS. Stacked up, that's probably around like, I don't know, somewhere in the budget of $150. As I started learning a little bit about hardware development, one of the first prototypes that I created to consolidate all this in the top right corner was a rig that I built called the Audit Pi. Basically, I 3D printed a case, slapped all these components inside, but I removed the headers and soldered them together. Added an integrated battery management system, GPS, and a couple other components. Some people actually made fun of me for this at the time because I think this was around the time when the FCC was under fire, like that guy Ajit Pai, who was like under fire for internet privacy reasons or whatever. They were saying like the name of my Audit Pi was phonetically close to that. So I got some pretty interesting comments on that. But yeah, at the time I was building a lot of rigs, mostly with Raspberry Pis, and naturally in the process of building these things, I destroyed a whole bunch. This got pretty expensive, particularly for someone who didn't have a lot of income at the time. But also, you guys probably know that this holds especially true like in this economy with how hard it is to get a hold of these Raspberry Pis for a reasonable price. So this is where I got my first introduction to microcontrollers. So I don't have it referenced here, but I discovered a researcher named Stefan, who also goes by Spacehoon, and he creates this project called the ESP8266 Author. Are any of you guys familiar with that? They come in these form factors like wristwatches, this like Game Boy-esque form factor, but they're based around this particular microcontroller called the ESP8266. What I like about microcontrollers, for one, they're extremely cheap. As opposed to a Raspberry Pi, if you do end up burning or blowing up one of these things, for the price of one Raspberry Pi, you can probably get your hands on like 50 of these nowadays. They're extremely cheap. You can find them from like between $1 to $5 on AliExpress. But on top of that, you also don't have to worry about like setting up an entire operating system, installing drivers, buying an external Wi-Fi dongle that might cost like somewhere between $20 to $30, and like setting up all this additional hardware. It has all of that stuff integrated and built in. Of course, the only catch is you have to program most of that yourself. But as someone who is the end developer of the tools that I'm putting out, I know that the content that I'm creating for beginners and the tools that I'm putting out there, as long as I create like a prepackaged binary, I can pretty much ensure that all my users or viewers have to do is just flash this over to their chip, and it's going to be working right out of the box. But I was really attracted to the idea of using microcontrollers for reconnaissance, so I wanted to explore Basically ways that I could start building WarDriving rigs with this, naturally. So in the top right, you can see one of the early rigs that I ended up creating. And it's a very rudimentary, simple form factor. It's literally just a Wi-Fi chip sandwiched with a GPS module. And what's also cool, of course, is the integrated hardware functionality, or the ability to have hardware expansibility. So you can add on things like a micro SD card, so you can store logs that you can then parse over into Python or Wiggle or things like that. And then, of course, a battery management system. So let's take a look at a couple of the early rigs that I built based off of this prototype and form factor. Just on a completely separate side note, when I was creating this presentation, it was a little bit depressing trying to find like pictures of the old things that I built, and I really wish that I documented my projects more. So if any of you guys are creating cool projects, I highly recommend you take as many photos as possible, videos, write down pretty much everything that you can. Because I probably created like 15 to 20 iterations of completely new proof of concepts in rigs at the time that I have no evidence of like ever having existed, except for these like 3 really shitty photos that I found on an old phone. So I'll try to explain what these are. In the top right corner, this is one of the first projects that I built with the ESP8266, and it's one of my favorites. This is a form factor called the ESP01. It's one of the smallest that you can find. I basically embedded this inside of a USB wall charger and planted this like in my house, in my dad's law office, and like a couple other places. And it acted as a kind of flow meter or proximity sensor, so I could basically remotely detect like if certain people were passing in and out of the area, or like see who was home, or like what neighbors were nearby, which is really fun. On the left, so that's pretty much just a dismembered version of the prototype that I showed in the previous slide. The total build cost for that, by the way, was like somewhere around $10. But this was an episode that I did on Hack5 where we strapped this thing to the bottom of my friend's drone. And I think we flew like a 2 or 3 mile perimeter around a park and had our friend like walk a pattern through it. But just using this like really crappy prototype that I threw together, we were able to triangulate his precise location and pattern like as he walked through. And what's more is this is just an omnidirectional antenna. It wasn't something that was even like focused, but from somewhere like a couple hundred feet up in the ground, this microcontroller was capable of doing that. And then in the bottom, this is one of the first prototypes that I think I built. It's basically just like a really crappy breadboarded Adafruit Feather, a TFT, an SD card, a GPS, and a couple other things. But this is probably the first WarDriving payload that I developed. My mom wasn't too happy with this. But what I did was I installed a reflective film on her windshield so it acted as like a heads-up display so I could see it while we were like driving, and literally sandwiched like a breadboard right up on the dashboard. And I also created a couple other prototypes and payloads at the time. I was kind of obsessed with the idea of making them as low cost as possible, and also create like a sort of recipe or formula where I could build as many of these things as I wanted as quickly as possible. And also create like sort of one of the ideas that I had was building like Wi-Fi throwies. So I could just like easily hammer one of these things out in like 10 to 15 minutes, build up like a whole army of them, and then maybe like chuck them up on a building somewhere and have them like gather reconnaissance for me. So I wanted to take this a step further. Also, like at this time, I wasn't really using the reconnaissance for anything particularly useful. I was just more obsessed with the idea of like building this really cool hardware. So along the process, one of the ideas that I had was, besides the Wi-Fi throwies, was just making these things like as ubiquitous as possible, placing them everywhere. As you saw with the rig that I mounted on my bike, I wanted one of these like in my car. I wanted one on my bike. At one point, I even built one that I installed like on my skateboard and stuff like that. So I came up with an idea. I wanted to become as lazy as possible with this and see how I could outsource or remove myself from the WarDriving process as much as possible. So I was thinking to myself, how can I do this? And I want to prepare you guys for the next slide you're about to see. So this is a really shitty graphic that I created like 15 minutes before the first time I did this presentation a month ago at B-Sides. But what I was thinking was, what doesn't contribute to the economy? What freeloads off the goodwill of people because they think they're cute? And the answer to that is cats. So this is what I came up with, and this is my genius plan. So the basic premise here that I came up with is, so it's not that far of a stretch. We already embed like RFID and like GPS trackers and stuff like that in cats. So I was like, we can take it a step farther and use this for enslaving them for gathering wireless reconnaissance. Why not? So yeah, basically strap these things to cats, have them go out, gather wireless intel, and then phone this information back home. So ethics reasons completely aside, I didn't really think about like the practicality of this when it comes to actually receiving that reconnaissance back, or like how I would actually charge the battery or anything like that. But this was sort of my like blue sky idea for how I wanted to use this prototype and like how ubiquitous and low cost and disposable I wanted to make these things. This is still on my project list, by the way. Okay, so now I want to draw the focus back into DNS DriveBy and also like how all this work sort of culminates into that in the creation of this project. So on the note of telemetry, probably the most obvious way to do this is through a SIM card module. So you can actually source these things for relatively cheap. You can find these for like between, I don't know, $10 to $15, Amazon, AliExpress, whatever have you. And this is pretty much the obvious, like, banal way to do this. But as I mentioned, one of my goals with the hardware that I create is making it as accessible and as cheap as possible. So one of the things that I didn't like about this, for one, it adds an additional cost to the ESP8266 microcontroller, and microcontrollers in general can sometimes be constrained by the amount of hardware resources they have available, whether that's like pins or memory or stuff like that. So adding an additional module that has to interface with this and then also perform tasks on top of the Wi-Fi scanning and GPS logging and things like that would be additional overhead that I wasn't ready to implement in my project. But not only that, as far as the beginner perspective is concerned, this adds an additional bar where you have to buy extra hardware. I then have to account for that like in the case designs. And then also, presumably, you would have to register the SIM card. That's all an additional cost that I wasn't ready to add to my projects. On the right, you can see, just for comparison, like a ubiquitous GPS tracker you can find on Amazon. Like typically the way these communicate, pretty obviously, is over like an LTE connection. But this brings me back to the definition that I presented at the beginning of my presentation, which is DNS DriveBy as a technique for performing reconnaissance over open Wi-Fi networks. Because around this time, I think I saw a friend shared with me a piece of research that I think I saw either on like Hackaday or Hackster or something like that, where someone actually used open Wi-Fi networks as a means of telemetry already, and I thought that was like pretty damn cool. I think someone even went so far as like implementing it on the direct microcontroller I'm talking about today, which is why I noted this isn't completely new research. But I actually didn't discover that until like 2 months into this project. But anyways, yeah, that's sort of where I got the groundwork for the payload that I'm about to talk about in just a second here. I basically wanted to try out and demonstrate the validity of using these open Wi-Fi networks as a means of remote communication. Also another note, so the benefit to this is kind of twofold as well, which I didn't realize until after the fact. For one, besides cutting down the costs and also the fact that it would be more taxing hardware-wise, like the amount of like memory resources, it would draw more battery and things like that. The second implication is not that I would use this for anything creepy, but you know, someone might. From a privacy perspective as well, registering a SIM card or one of these unique trackers, this is going to have a unique ID associated with it. So if someone were to like discover this on their car or something like that, it's pretty easy to trace this back to the original person, or at least fairly easy compared to something like this that might be a little bit more discreet. All right, so let's talk about the actual project, and I'm going to start with a little bit of a background for how it came to be. So as I mentioned, one of the things that I do is I create video content for Hack5. So I think almost a year ago, I was with some friends in LA who are also creators on the channel, and I'll refer to them as friend A and friend B. But we were brainstorming ideas for video content that we could do, and we wanted to make an episode that wasn't too technical. We wanted it to be accessible for an average person to watch and not be overwhelmed with like hacker lingo and stuff like that. So we came up with a pretty simple idea. We wanted to do a tracking challenge. This is what was proposed. So we had one of our non-technical friends that was hanging out with us, Irish, who I'll introduce in just a second in some of these later slides. So the idea was we would try out some different hacking techniques, some different tools, some different off-the-shelf products, and see which of them was the most viable for tracking him down. Which would act sort of as a showcase for like an average person to see like different threats they might want to look out for. So sort of as a control for the experiment, what we did was we used some ubiquitous like off-the-shelf products. One of our friends went with like tile trackers and air tags and one of the ubiquitous trackers that I talked about earlier. And our second friend used some off-the-shelf hacker tools, particularly Hack5 products like the Wi-Fi Pineapple and the Wi-Fi Coconut, and wanted to showcase how signals intelligence and signals that are being emanated from your phone can be used to track you down. So as someone who specializes in building hardware prototypes, so oof, I'm getting very dry. As someone who specializes in building hardware prototypes, what I wanted to do was basically demonstrate how a hacker could use their skills to build something that was very low cost and discreet and how this might pose a threat to you. And I also wanted to use this as an excuse to try out the reconnaissance idea that I saw or had before. So I built a low-cost payload that was sort of a mix of my two friends' ideas, where it takes advantage of wireless reconnaissance. I'll talk about this in a second, but that being WarDriving and the use of open Wi-Fi networks to discreetly provide me with location updates on someone this might be planted on. And I also liked the idea of having a physical implant. So I built this prototype that I ended up sticking on my friend's car. When it comes to the hardware that was used for this, total build cost was somewhere around or under $10. It's pretty straightforward. If you guys want to find like the full documentation for this, I'll have the links at the end of the presentation. I used a $2 Wi-Fi chip. It's the ESP01 form factor. It's very tiny. It's like the size of your thumbnail. A $3 GPS module, a handful of power management components like a low dropout regulator, a LiPo battery that I literally ripped out of a drone, and a couple other things. And then also this enclosure that I 3D printed. So it was a pretty small form factor. All in all, it came out to be like 60 by 40 millimeters. And with my friend's consent, I placed this on his car. Also, if you're worried about this thing, like tracking you down as far as like security implications go, I'll talk about why this proof of concept isn't the most sound at the end of the presentation. It actually worked kind of shittily. So the only really limitation that I ran up against in designing the hardware, since at this point I have designed so many different iterations of these WarDriving rigs, was battery. So I finally came around to a time where I needed to implement some sort of system that would allow me to regulate how much power consumption was being used. So the thing is, I was using just like a 400 milliamp hour battery, literally one that I ripped out of like a tiny quadcopter. At maximum capacity, the ESP is drawing about 170 milliamp hours, so this would only last it around like 2.5 hours, which really sucks. So if I were to plant this on my friend's car, there's no way for me to determine when he's actually driving and at which point to initiate capturing reconnaissance. So I don't want it to waste battery while he might be just like sitting idle in a parking lot or whatever. So to get around this limitation, what I did was I designed a very rudimentary wake-up system where what I did at first was I hooked up a vibration sensor between the reset pin and ground on the chip. Pretty straightforward. The idea was it would start up, the chip would start up in deep sleep mode, and the second he starts moving, it would just trigger an impulse that would turn it on. Does anyone see a problem with this by chance? Neither did I. So turns out just hooking up the switch between reset and ground was triggering constant resets as it was in motion. So I needed a way to turn the switch off when the chip actually powered on. So I ended up creating like a very simple logic gate which uses an input pin on the microcontroller to tell the switch, or not really like tell it, but basically not allow the switch to sync itself to ground once the payload is actually fired up. So this is pretty much the only limitation that I ran into. When we actually ran the experiment, I wasn't able to implement this smart wake-up system at the time, unfortunately. I did this retroactively. But the amount of power that it ends up actually saving when it's in deep sleep mode, it goes from drawing 170 milliamp hours all the way down to 0.02. So this is pretty considerably a big difference. So yeah, anyways, that's the final form factor that I ended up placing on his card the day before. And that's about as far as we'll go as it concerns the hardware. So now we're going to talk about the actual telemetry technique. And I guess we've discussed the drive-by component of this, but now we're going to talk about the DNS component to DNS drive-by and how exactly this payload takes advantage of open Wi-Fi networks. So right off the bat, I pretty much hit a wall. I forgot these existed, and I guess I should have known from like back in my years when I didn't have internet and was sitting outside of Starbucks like for hours. But captive portals are a thing. And you've most definitely seen these if you've ever connected to a Wi-Fi network outside of your house. Coffee shops, Starbucks, hotel Wi-Fi, in-flight Wi-Fi, things like that. But just like any other device that's connecting to open Wi-Fi networks, when my payload would connect to an open Wi-Fi network and attempt to send over GPS data from my friend's route or something like that, it would get served a captive portal page, which it doesn't know what the hell to do with because it can't fill it out. The issue with this is that there's just too many fields that you simply can't account for because they always ask like a whole bunch of random shit, like your name and your social security number, like whatever have you. And it just can't account for every type of captive portal that it's going to encounter in the wild. So filling this out or bypassing these captive portals just isn't really that viable through that way. Luckily, the way that most captive portals are implemented are in one of three ways. So the first two, HTTP redirects and firewall-based rules, these are pretty trivial to bypass. Basically, all these are, they're just simple redirects. You can think of them like that, like where if you were to type out a website in your browser, it would just forward you to a captive portal landing page. So this can be bypassed with a technique called DNS Exfiltration, which we'll look at in just a second here. And the premise to that is, the way that you can think of it is like DNS. You guys are probably familiar with DNS, but it kind of sits a layer below this where it's a critical service, obviously, that lets you resolve domain names, like if you were to type out google.com in your browser, to a computer-readable IP address. With these first two methods of how captive portals are implemented, they don't block this service. So while you're not able to directly connect to the internet and create a typical web request, what you can do instead is take advantage of DNS requests and use this as a way to exfiltrate your data directly through the captive portal page. The third way that a captive portal can be implemented is through DNS redirection, in which case this wouldn't work. For whatever reason, I actually haven't seen this implemented in the wild before. Like Starbucks Wi-Fi uses one of the first two methods. But in short, the way that works is it actually does interface with DNS resolution. So if you were to type out a domain like alyxlynd.com or google.com or something in your browser, it would actually resolve that domain name to a local one that's hosting the captive portal page. So the technique I'm about to show you guys wouldn't work in that event. So the way typical requests are made, before I dive into this, the architecture would look something like this. So you would have, like, let me just think of a thought experiment. Like if you are gathering like temperature data or something, if you're building an IoT device, you'd take this data, you'd package it inside of like a post request, a get request or something, fire this off to a server that's ready to receive this on the back end through an API, and then you get a response back saying like, oh, it's been successfully received. Awesome. Thing about DNS exfiltration is I don't need any of that. I don't need the bilateral communication. I don't need to know if my data went through. And I don't even need a full internet connection for this to work. Basically, all that has to happen is my payload has to be able to fire off a one-way request containing my reconnaissance, my GPS data, or whatever else have you. And just make sure that it gets to the other side. So a second benefit to this, since it's not really connecting to the internet, these DNS requests are actually a lot faster than like packaging this inside of an actual web request and creating that over the internet. So in effect, this is what it looks like at a block level. So I have my GPS tracker. My friend's like driving down the road, whatever. It sees an open Wi-Fi network. It's like, oh, great, I'll connect to it. It gets served a captive portal page, which it doesn't know what the hell to do with, so it throws it out the window. But then what it can do is it can ask to resolve a domain name like alyxlynd.com. By itself, that's not really useful. It'll get the response for like the IP address of alyxlynd.com. It doesn't really need that. But the way that you can actually exfiltrate data through this DNS request is through the use of subdomains. So what you can do is you can append arbitrary subdomains, like, you know how there's like docs.google.com, slides.google.com, or whatever. So what I can do is create an arbitrary request to like gpsdata.alyxlynd.com or reconnaissance.alyxlynd.com. And then over on my end, all I have to do is go to my server, download a log of all the subdomains that were accessed, dump this into a file, like a CSV file that then I can like interface with in Python or something like that, and create a visualization to basically see like all the places that my friend visited. So that's exactly what I did. And we'll talk about how I extracted this data in just a second. But on the right side, you can see a CSV file that I downloaded. These are the raw coordinates. So this is like the latitude, longitude, and then also date time information for the exact points where these were logged. We'll talk about one catch to, because obviously you can't just do like 3.14554 negative 118 whatever the hell .alyxlynd.com. We'll talk about how I actually did that in a second. But this is literally the file that I just downloaded straight from the server. And a lot of people don't know this, but when I'm lazy, instead of having to use like Python or something to parse my data, there's a site, there's like Google Maps, but there's also mymaps.google.com, which is a really quick way that you can just like plop open like a CSV file or a KML file or even like a file that you generate from Wiggle and be able to just like directly render this into useful data points. So that's exactly what I did. I just dragged and dropped this into mymaps.google.com. I created this plot of my friend's route, and I was able to successfully determine the places that he visited throughout the day. So this was a success. So you can see the two places that I circled where he spent most of his time that day. So the first place was pretty normal. He visited the Glendale Galleria, the Americana at Brand. It's like a normal place where someone would like hang out and eat ice cream or whatever, right? For whatever fucking reason, the second place that he visited was Forest Lawn. I don't know why, a cemetery. And this was aerial footage that we got. He's like somewhere in here. But yeah, in short, I basically was able to prove the validity of using open Wi-Fi networks as a means of telemetry and also gathering, or rather providing GPS location updates on a $3 microcontroller at that. So you guys might be curious about a couple things. For one, I'm going to wrap up with how my other friends' results turned out, and then also talk about the infrastructure that I actually used to receive those requests. So I mentioned one of my friends, he went the typical creeper route where he used off-the-shelf products like trackers and tile and AirTags and those kinds of things. Obviously, he had the most success out of us. The GPS tracker performed the best because it uses LTE and has constant communication. Tile tracker performed the second best. We would get intermittent updates like every a couple of minutes. For some reason, the AirTags just straight up never worked. We got one update. Our friend was walking through like a pretty dense area the whole time. As you can see, he had like a lot of friends nearby. No, when he was at the mall, actually, it was pretty dense. There were a lot of like people with iPhones and things like that. But we only got one update like in the entire time he was there. I don't know why. He even walked past like an Apple store, I think. So that was kind of disappointing. My other friend used a combination of wireless reconnaissance techniques and WarDriving, and also a payload that I strapped to his drone, which I talked about earlier. But we also used aerial footage to survey him throughout the experiment, and it also made for pretty cool B-roll for the video. So it kind of felt like we were hunting Bigfoot or something like that. It was pretty fun. So in the bottom corner, you can see we circled our friend who's wearing a shirt in bright red. And then also our camera guy's also like trailing closely behind wearing a yellow shirt. So the running joke that day was they were dressed up as like ketchup and mustard, and it made them really easy to spot, kind of like stains on a t-shirt. But yeah, that's just about it for the tracking experiment. But now I want to introduce you guys to a couple of things before I wrap up the presentation. One, I want to backtrack a little bit and talk about the infrastructure that I was using to actually receive the DNS requests, which you guys might be interested in. To kind of hit a point that I meant to iterate more throughout my slides. On the topic of creating content that's accessible for beginners, and also one thing that we tried to do with this presentation was make it palatable for an average person to watch. So we tried not to drown it out with too many like technical details or like technical jargon or stuff like that. So the challenge with like the payload that I was creating, damn, was making this as visual and easy to follow along with as possible. So one of my favorite tools for doing this when it comes to web-based demonstrations is CanaryTokens. So are any of you guys familiar with this, or have you used CanaryTokens by chance? If you guys could raise your hands. Okay, cool. A couple of people. That's awesome. So CanaryTokens is a really great tool. I recommend everyone checks this out. It's actually really easy to work with. So CanaryTokens is developed by a company called Thanks to Canary. Basically, they're like these bite-sized honeypots that you can download that come in a variety of form factors. You can download like an image, you can download, or you can generate like a URL, you can generate a bugged like PDF or Word document or EXE or these kinds of things. And this makes it really simple for you to just like put one of these on your computer or server and determine if it's been accessed or compromised by a malicious actor. If one of these like juicy files has been opened up, it'll send you an alert directly to your email and also a really nice dashboard interface. One of the tokens that they offer is actually a DNS token, which is really helpful. But literally you just type in your email address, spits out one of these tokens, and then you get a unique subdomain at CanaryTokens.com, which you can see in the bottom left corner. And this, I'm going to read it to you guys painfully. Fukum 3LCU 44AYP 5SFS 21 DN0 UMVY.CanaryTokens.com. Very cool. But it's basically the same process that I talked about. You literally just take your data, prepend it to this unique subdomain. So you can do like gpsdata.canarytokens.com. And they also provide all the documentation you need to actually exfiltrate data here, which you can see on the right. As I mentioned, it follows exactly the same. The only kind of like catch to it is you just have to encode this data to Base32. So the reason for this is if you have like GPS data, like I do, which has special characters like a comma delimiter, periods and things like that, you obviously can't type this stuff out in a browser. It'll fuck with it. So what you have to do is convert this to Base32, which is URL safe. It's completely alphanumeric. And then you can append this information, or you would prepend this information to the URL and then fire this off. That might sound a little bit nebulous, but in a second I'll show you guys a command that you can actually use so you can try this out the next time you're at like Starbucks or somewhere. But this is the view of the CanaryTokens dashboard. They make it really easy to be able to view this data and also receive alerts. So I wish I had a better picture. This was just like B-roll that we shot. But basically on the right side of the screen, there's these little drop downs where you can see the individual requests that were received on the CanaryTokens backend. Highlighted there, you can see some GPS coordinates that I received, and the memo that I set was DNS Exfiltration video. But literally after this, all you can do, you can just go to the top of the page, click download as CSV file, and then from there you can import this into like Google Maps or whatever have you, and build a plot with it. So if you're wondering how you can try this out yourself, if it sounds terribly complicated, curl. Curl is a very ubiquitous command line tool. It's installed on damn near every computer. Windows, Mac, most Unix systems. It's a one-line request where you can literally just do curl and then the URL. So before you connect to a captive portal the next time you're at Starbucks, you can generate a canary token on your phone, open up your terminal, and then try this out. So in this case, I ran curl some base32 information .mycanarytokensurl.com. And then on the decoded little dropdown on the CanaryTokens website, you can see that this reads meow123. Let me see if I have time for this one. Okay, so before we go into the conclusion of this presentation, what I try to do with this, I try to keep this like as high level as possible, and I know there were a lot of different things that I hit with this talk. There were a lot of moving parts to this. There was the hardware, the software, a little bit of hacking techniques, and things like that. I tried to keep this as high level and conceptual as possible. So I tried to stay out of the territory of like talking about the nitty gritty details of embedded development and all of the plights that I came across when actually building this prototype. So yeah, from a high level conceptual standpoint, I hope you can see basically how this technique works and that it's also fairly straightforward. When it comes to actually developing the architecture that's running on the microcontroller, as the person who's like coding this myself, it kind of really sucked ass. If you want to learn more about how I built this and like how all the internal architecture works and stuff like that, I'll have a link at the end where you can read my blog post on it. But I'll briefly talk about that since we have a bit of time. But basically, like any good project starts out, I over-architected like the fuck out of this. I overscoped this. I came up with a bunch of crazy concepts and ideas for how I thought this should work and never actually implemented any of it. So one of the things that I did was I designed this very crazy memory system that didn't end up working so well. And in the process, I learned a lot about memory allocation and all of the plights of developing on a very constrained microcontroller. We'll talk more about like the microcontroller aspect in a second. But if you're interested, this is how the internal memory system works on the chip, which only has 1 megabyte of flash and 52 kilobytes of RAM. Basically, it multitasks and hands off between Wi-Fi scanning and GPS logging. It flip-flops back and forth because the ESP only has one core, unfortunately. While it's doing that, it'll take the latitude and longitude data that it's reading, wait for an appropriate time to store this over into flash memory. And then I created a circular queue on the flash memory system, so it would like overwrite old data. But then I discovered that flash memory doesn't actually have pointers, so I couldn't implement a proper circular queue. And then I learned about like where leveling, and a bunch of my shit crashed. And then while it's handing off tasks between Wi-Fi scanning and GPS tracking, it's also doing another third thing, which is converting all of that data back to Base32, because you have to convert it to Base32 in order to fire it off as a DNS request. So the reason why I'm also storing it on flash memory and handing off back and forth between them is storing it on flash memory allows it to be persistent. If it's on RAM, if my device powers off or loses battery, it's going to lose all of that data. So flash allows it to be a little bit more fault tolerant and resilient and store that data in the event of a crash. But then what it does is it encodes that data back to flash memory as Base32, fires this off as a DNS request. But basically, architecting all of this really sucked. It was kind of really slow because I'm running all of this, again, on a single core microcontroller that has like 52 kilobytes of RAM. But I did learn a lot throughout the process. And I guess this brings me to one of my concluding points. And one of the biggest pain points of working with microcontrollers, and I hope you guys can see this. So you might be wondering, why the hell would you choose to do this on such a constrained microcontroller if it sucked and if it was slow and things like that? To reiterate on the 3 points that I made at the beginning of my presentation, one starting out with the harder proof of concept itself. Again, the scope of this project was to demonstrate a proof of concept. It's not meant to be a completely resilient like project or something that's being used like in an actual engagement or something like that. So for the sake of our presentation, I was able to demonstrate and prove the validity of using open Wi-Fi networks as a means of telemetry successfully. And at that, I was also able to do it on one of the cheapest microcontrollers that's very ubiquitously found. So if someone who might not have access to more expensive hardware, like if I were to do this on a Raspberry Pi or a computer, which is obviously much more capable, not everyone might have access to these kinds of things or would be able to go out of their way to buy a Wi-Fi dongle and WarDriving gear and things. So if someone wanted to try this at a very low cost without fear of like screwing up their stuff, a microcontroller is perfect for this. If they just want to try out this demonstration, that's great. And I feel like this did that pretty well. The second sort of side benefit to this, and the reason why I went with such a constrained microcontroller, it helped me keep it under the $10 price point, so I could just create like a clickbaity title, like Stealthy $10 GPS tracker, and that sounded pretty cool. But on the other two notes that I made, as far as lowering the barrier to entry for security research goes, and also microcontrollers for low-cost security applications, I guess this sort of hits on the point that I just made, but it is one of my biggest goals to make security research more accessible. and I guess I said this already, but using hardware that people can easily find and easily source themselves without fear of like screwing up their stuff is one of the merits to using microcontrollers for this. But also for security research, I hope you guys can see and maybe take some inspiration for future payloads or things that you might build, considering using microcontrollers when it's just for like a single purpose application or for building a low cost rapid prototype. So that's just about the end of my presentation. I briefly want to just show you guys some improvements that I'm working on and making to the project real quick. I actually have some of the payloads up here if you guys want to see this after the talk. But one of the things that I'm doing to make this project a little more accessible and easy to follow along with is I'm designing these little PCBs that people can put together. And what's really cool about this is actually one of my favorite form factors for the ESP8266. It's called the D1 Mini. But this is a form factor that makes expansibility really simple. So if you didn't want to use a microcontroller that's nearly as crappy or constrained memory-wise, you can literally just unplug it and swap it out for a different variety, like the ESP32, which is more memory. It's dual core. You can even do like Bluetooth WarDriving. And they also have these other really cool form factors that allow you to add on extra hardware. So if you wanted to gather additional telemetry, if you wanted to add micro SD card expansibility or stuff like that, this really tiny and cheap kit makes it really easy to toy around with that. So one of the things that I'm creating are these really cheap rigs that people can just slap together to make WarDriving more accessible and be able to make modifications to this payload on their own and tool around with stuff for a very low cost. That's just about all I have for this. I'm actually also working on 2 video demonstrations that are coming out later this week. So if you guys want to stay up to date with that, you can check out this website, dnsdriveby.com, to learn more about the project, see some other proof of concepts that I'm building around this technique. And I didn't have time to include slides on it, unfortunately, since I finished most of this morning. But there's also some attributes as well to some of the previous projects that I referenced, building off the work of other people who have developed techniques like this similarly in the past. So yeah, anyways, I'm Alyx Lynd. Thank you guys for coming to my presentation. And also, let me know if you guys have questions. And these are available to check out up front if you'd like to.